The wind of that year did not knock before it entered. It came through the walls, through the floors, a thief that stole warmth and left a fine red dust on everything. The winter of 1934 came down on the plains like a judgment, but it was the wind that was the executioner. It was a constant, keening presence that frayed the nerves and scoured the soul. It peeled paint from the barns, lifted shingles from the houses, and carried the topsoil of Oklahoma eastward on a relentless, rust-colored tide. For the people who lived there, it was not weather. It was a siege. The central struggle was against an enemy that could not be seen, only felt. It was a physical pressure, a force that leaned on the flat, broad sides of every building, looking for a weakness. It found them, always. A loose board, a poorly set nail, a frame that had been weakened by the endless drought. The cold was a simple thing. It could be fought with fire. The dust was a misery. It could be endured with wet cloths and sealed windows. But the wind was a different beast. The wind was a wrecker. It came with a sound like a freight train that never passed, a low roar that became the background music to every waking and sleeping moment. Elara saw the struggle etched on the faces of her neighbors. She saw it in the slump of their shoulders as they surveyed the splintered remains of a henhouse, in the grim set of their jaws as they tried to patch a barn roof for the third time in as many months. Every farm told the same story. Men would build their barns tall and proud, monuments of timber against the vast, empty sky. They built them the way their fathers had, with straight lines and right angles, a testament to man's dominion over the land. And the wind, with casual indifference, would dismantle them. It would work a corner loose, then peel the wall back like the page of a book. It would get underneath the roof and lift it, sending it cartwheeling into a barren field. The community was trapped in a cycle of defiant reconstruction. They would gather, a dozen men with hammers and saws, and raise a neighbor's barn again. They would use stronger nails, thicker planks, and more bracing. They would curse the wind and toast their own resilience with harsh, homemade liquor. And for a week or a month, the new structure would stand. But the wind was patient. It was a thing of geology and seasons, and it had more time than they had timber. The problem was not in their effort, but in their thinking. They believed the answer was to build stronger, to resist with more force. They never considered that the answer might be to not resist at all. Elara was a widow. Her husband Thomas had been taken not by the wind, but by the dust that rode upon it. It had settled in his lungs, a fine, sharp grit that had slowly, inexorably, turned his breathing to a painful rasp, and then to silence. He had left her with two small children, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Rose, and a piece of land that was becoming less a farm and more a desert. The community saw her as a fragile thing, a woman ill-suited to the brutal realities of their existence. They offered her pity, which felt like a weight, and advice, which was always the same. Sell the land, take the children, and go back east, where the world was still green. But Thomas had left her something else. He had been a quiet man, a reader. While other men spent their evenings oiling harnesses or sharpening tools, Thomas had sat by the lamp with books. They were old, heavy things he had brought with him from his family across the ocean. Books filled with strange diagrams of bridges and cathedrals, fortresses and windmills. He had been a student of structure, fascinated by the way things stood up and the reasons they fell down. He had filled the margins with notes in a precise, spidery script. After his death, in the long, quiet evenings, Elara had begun to read them herself. She wasn't an engineer, but she was a desperate mother, and that gave her a unique kind of focus. The idea came to her one night as the house shuddered from a gust that seemed intent on pushing it from its very foundations. Rose was crying in her sleep, and the fine silt of the plains was drifting in from under the door, forming a tiny, red dune on the floorboards. Elara was looking at a drawing in one of Thomas's books. It was not a barn or a house. It was a diagram of an old coastal fortification, built to withstand the punishing winds of the sea. It was low to the ground, with thick, sloping walls and a rounded roof. The caption, in a language she could not read, was underlined by Thomas. Beside it he had written in English, "The gale does not break the stone that lies low." That was it. The revelation was not a shout, but a whisper in the roaring wind. Everyone built up into the teeth of the gale. They presented a flat, defiant face to the wind, and the wind, accepting the challenge, broke it. What if, instead of building up, she built down? What if she created a shape that did not fight the wind, but guided it? An idea began to form, a structure that was more a part of the earth than a challenge to the sky. It would be low, semi-subterranean, with a long, curved roof that would rise from the ground on one side and slope back down on the other. It would not be a box for the wind to punch, but a smooth hillock for it to climb over. When she first spoke of it, the men of the community thought she had lost her mind to grief. She tried to explain her idea to Silas, the most respected builder in the county, a man whose hands were as hard and unyielding as the oak he worked with. She scratched a drawing in the dirt with a stick, a long, low mound with a shielded entrance. Silas stared at it, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked from the drawing to her, then back to the drawing. Then he laughed. It was not a kind sound. It was deep and dismissive, the laugh of a man who knew the world to be made of straight lines and solid facts. "A dirt-roofed grave, is it?" he said, kicking dust over her drawing. "You mean to bury your stock before the wind does?" The other men who had gathered around chuckled in agreement. The idea was absurd. A barn was a barn. It had 4 walls, a peaked roof, and a big door. It stood tall. That was the nature of a barn. What she was describing was a cave, a molehill. "The first good rain, that thing will turn to mud and collapse on itself," another man chimed in. "You'll lose everything." Their skepticism was a wall, as solid and unforgiving as the ones they built. They warned her it was foolishness, a waste of what little money and energy she had left. They told her she was dishonoring her husband's memory by entertaining such a bizarre fantasy. Their mockery was relentless, but it was born of a strange kind of concern. They saw a vulnerable woman making a terrible mistake, and their only tools were scorn and dismissal. They could not imagine a different way, because to do so would be to admit that everything they had ever done, every barn they had ever raised and lost, had been wrong. Their pride was framed in timber and nailed together with tradition. Elara's idea was a threat to the very foundations of their knowledge. She listened to them, her face calm, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not argue. She did not try to show them the diagrams in the book. She knew it was useless. Their minds were closed as tightly as their storm cellars. When they were done, she simply nodded. "I thank you for your concern," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I have to try." She turned and walked back to her small house, the sound of their laughter following her like a cold shadow. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. The work began the next morning. There was no crew of helpful neighbors, no shared labor fueled by coffee and camaraderie. There was only Elara, her 10-year-old son Samuel, a pair of shovels, and the vast, silent land. She had chosen a spot behind the house, a shallow depression where the ground was slightly softer. She marked out the dimensions with stakes and twine, a long, wide oval. The sun beat down, and the wind was a constant companion, whipping her hair across her face and trying to steal the breath from her lungs. The first day was an agony of digging. The top layer of soil was loose dust, but beneath it was a hard, sun-baked clay that fought back against the shovel. Every scoop was a victory. Samuel, thin but determined, worked beside her, his face set in a serious imitation of a man's resolve. He did not ask why they were digging a hole instead of building a frame. He simply trusted his mother. By evening, their hands were raw with blisters, their backs ached with a fire they had never known, and the hole was barely a foot deep. They had moved a mountain of earth, but it felt like they had only scratched the surface. As the days turned into weeks, their solitary labor became a spectacle for the rest of the community. Farmers would slow their wagons as they passed her property, staring at the woman and the boy, toiling in their pit. The hole grew, slowly, painfully. It became a wide, shallow basin, 5 feet deep at its center. She was not just digging, she was shaping. She was creating long, sloping sides, banking the excavated earth into thick ramparts that would form the lower walls of the structure. She worked with a methodical patience that the others mistook for madness. While Elara and Samuel moved earth one shovelful at a time, a different kind of work was happening a mile down the road. The Henderson farm had lost its barn in the last big blow, and the community had rallied to rebuild it. Silas was in charge, directing a team of 12 men. The air rang with the sound of hammers striking nails, saws biting into fresh pine. They worked with a loud, confident energy. They were raising a monument to their own defiance, another tall, square bastion against the wind. In a single week, they had a frame up, walls sheathed, and a roof ready for shingles. They would look over toward Elara's land and shake their heads at the sight of her still in the dirt, a lonely figure in a cloud of dust. She was digging a hole while they were raising a cathedral. Her methods were strange and painstaking. She was not building with timber, but with the earth itself. The foundation was made of rocks that she and Samuel gathered from the dry creek bed, a task that took them 2 weeks of back-breaking work, hauling them one by one on a small wooden cart. She laid them in a thick, wide base at the bottom of her excavated basin. For the walls, she used the packed earth, mixed with dried prairie grass and water hauled from the well, creating a dense, heavy substance like adobe. She was not nailing boards together, she was sculpting walls. The innovation that truly baffled her neighbors was the roof structure. She used salvaged timbers from their old, wrecked barn, but she did not use them to create a steep, triangular pitch. Instead, she laid the main beams low across the structure, creating a gentle, arching curve. It was the shape of a tortoiseshell, a long, shallow dome. The cross beams were laid tightly, and on top of them she layered thick canvas, tarred against the rain. And then came the final, unbelievable step. She and Samuel began to cover the entire roof with the sod they had carefully removed when they first began digging. They were blanketing the structure in a living layer of earth and grass. It was a slow, deliberate process, a conversation with the landscape rather than a command shouted at it. The structure grew organically from the pit she had dug, less a building and more a feature of the terrain. The entrance was a single, low opening on the eastern side, the direction from which the wind seldom blew. It was further protected by a long, curved earthen bank that would force any stray gusts to flow up and around the opening. Inside, the air was cool and still, and the light was dim. It smelled of damp earth and clay. It did not look like a barn. It looked ancient. The great storm did not arrive with a warning. It was simply there. One afternoon the sky, which had been a pale, hazy blue, began to darken in the northwest. It was not the purple-black of a thunderstorm, but a roiling, ominous wall of brown, a black blizzard. The old-timers called them rollers because they looked like the entire horizon was rolling up toward you. The wind, which had been a constant moan, began to rise in pitch, becoming a piercing shriek. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sun vanished. Daylight was extinguished, replaced by a suffocating brown twilight. Ilara had been preparing. She had brought her 2 thin cows, her handful of chickens, and the family's old mule into the new structure. She had stocked it with water, food, and oil for the lamp. She led Samuel and Rose inside, pulling the heavy plank door shut behind them. The change was immediate. The scream of the wind dropped to a muffled, distant roar. The air, which had been thick with choking dust, was clear and still. A single lamp cast a warm, steady glow on the packed earth walls. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, there was peace. For the rest of the community, the world was indeed ending. The wind came not as a gust, but as a solid wall of force. It struck the tall, flat-sided barns with the impact of a physical blow. The Hendersons' new barn, the one built with such pride and confidence, began to groan. The timbers, green and strong, shrieked in protest. Silas and the Henderson family huddled in their storm cellar, listening to the destruction above. They heard a sound like a cannon shot as a main support beam snapped. Then came a wrenching, tearing sound of nails pulling free from wood, and finally, the deafening crash as the entire structure folded in on itself. It had lasted less than 3 weeks. All across the county, the same story was playing out. Tin roofs were torn from their moorings and sent sailing into the brown darkness, spinning deadly blades. Walls that had stood for a generation were broken into splinters. The dust was a relentless invader. It forced its way through every crack, every keyhole. It was so fine it passed through the fabric of wet cloths hung over windows. Families huddled together, breathing through damp rags, listening to the storm, trying to tear their homes apart. The cattle left in the fields were blinded, their lungs filled with dirt. They would be found days later, standing motionless, suffocated where they stood. It was a cataclysm of wind and earth. Inside Ilara's earthen barn, the storm was an abstract concept. The thick, sod-covered roof absorbed the fury of the wind. The low, curved profile offered no surface for the gale to grip. The wind simply flowed over it, a river flowing over a smooth stone. There were no rattling windows, no shuddering walls. The vibrations of the storm were soaked up by the sheer mass of the earth around them. Rose, who was usually terrified by the wind, slept peacefully in a small bed of hay. Samuel sat near the lamp, reading one of his father's books, his face calm in the soft light. The animals were quiet, sensing no danger. Ilara listened to the muffled roar from outside, a sound that she knew was tearing her neighbors' lives apart, and felt a profound, solemn stillness. It worked. The quiet wisdom of the book, the memory of her husband's patient studies, her own back-breaking labor, it had all worked. The storm raged for 2 days. It was a period of suspended time, a brown, roaring eternity. For Ilara and her children, it was a time of strange tranquility. They had their small store of food, their clean water. The air in the earthen shelter remained breathable, the temperature stable. They were an island of calm in a sea of chaos. For their neighbors, it was a descent into a special kind of hell. The dust coated every surface, turning food to grit and water to mud. The ceaseless, violent noise of the wind frayed every nerve, making sleep impossible. They were trapped in their cellars, praying for an end, any end, to the onslaught. When the wind finally began to subside on the 3rd morning, it did not leave silence in its wake. It left a world transformed. The sun rose on a landscape that was alien and hostile. Everything was buried under a thick blanket of brown dust. Fences had vanished. Roads were obliterated. The very contours of the land had been reshaped. And everywhere, There were the skeletons of barns, splintered timbers sticking out of the drifts of dirt like the ribs of dead behemoths. The air was still thick with haze, and the sun was a pale, sickly disk in the sky. Silas was one of the first to emerge. His own house had held, but his barn, the work of his own proud hands, was gone, utterly. He stood in the ruin of his farm, his face a mask of gray dust and black despair. He had lost 2 cows and his best horse. He felt a hollowness that went deeper than his empty pockets. It was a crisis of faith. Everything he knew, everything he had been taught about building, about standing strong, had been proven worthless. He had built with defiance, and his defiance had been broken. Then, through the haze, he thought of the widow. He thought of her foolish, dirt-roofed hole in the ground. He expected to find nothing but a muddy pit, another testament to the storm's power. Driven by a morbid curiosity, he began to walk toward her farm. The walk was a journey through a graveyard of ambition. He passed the Henderson place and saw the fresh splinters of their new barn scattered for half a mile. He passed 2 other farms, each one a scene of identical devastation. When he finally reached Elara's property, he stopped. The world was brown and broken, but there, rising gently from the ravaged land, was a low, green-brown mound. It was untouched. The sod on the roof was ruffled, but it held. The structure was so integrated with the landscape that it looked as if it had been there for 1,000 years, a natural feature that the storm had simply ignored. He approached it slowly, his boots sinking into the soft dust. He felt a sense of profound disbelief. It was impossible. It defied every principle of construction he held dear. He walked around it, touching the packed earth wall. It was solid, cool, and unyielding. He saw the single, low door, sheltered by its curved earthen bank. He hesitated for a long moment, his pride wrestling with his awe. Then he knocked. The sound was unnervingly loud in the still, muffled air. The door swung open, and Elara stood there. Her face was clean. Her dress was not covered in a film of grime. Behind her, in the warm lamplight, Silas could see her 2 children. They were safe. They were calm. The air that came from within the structure was cool and sweet, free of the choking dust that still hung heavy outside. The contrast was staggering. He had just walked through the apocalypse, and he was now looking into a sanctuary. He was a man who had built his life on the certainty of his knowledge, and in that single moment, all of it crumbled to dust. He was wrong. Utterly, completely, humiliatingly wrong. Elara looked at his stunned, dust-caked face. She saw the despair in his eyes, the ruin of his pride. She could have said 1,000 things. She could have reminded him of his laughter, of his scorn. She could have said, "I told you so." But she did none of those things. Her triumph was not in his defeat, but in her children's safety. She simply stepped aside. "Silas," she said, her voice soft, "you look thirsty." She turned and dipped a ladle into a bucket of clean water, holding it out to him. The gesture was simple, an act of pure hospitality. But for Silas, it was everything. It was forgiveness. It was grace. He took the ladle, his hand trembling slightly, and drank. The water was the cleanest, sweetest thing he had ever tasted. He looked around the interior, at the gently curving walls, the low arched roof supported by the thick, salvaged beams. He saw the animals, calm in their pens. He felt the profound, unshakable stillness of the place. It was not a grave, it was a womb. "How?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "How did it stand?" Elara walked over to a small shelf and picked up one of her husband's old books. She opened it to the diagram of the coastal fort. "Thomas used to say the wind is like a bully," she said quietly. It looks for something to push. If you give it nothing to push against, it grows tired and moves on. The earth holds what the wind tries to take. Silas did not return to the other farms with the story of Ilara's strange luck. He returned with a sermon of her wisdom. He gathered the other men, their faces grim with their own losses, and he told them what he had seen. He described the quiet, the clean air, the untouched structure. He spoke not with his usual bluster, but with the quiet humility of a convert. He told them that they had been fighting the wrong war. They had been trying to beat the wind, and the wind could not be beaten. The widow, he told them, had not fought it. She had understood it. At first there was disbelief, but the evidence was undeniable. One by one, then in small groups, the other farmers made the pilgrimage to Ilara's farm. They walked around the low, earthen barn, their hands tracing the curves of its walls. They peered inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim light, and saw the impossible truth. The laughter and mockery that had once echoed across these fields were replaced by a profound, respectful silence. They saw their own splintered barns in their minds, and then they saw this. The contrast was a lesson more powerful than any words. They had built with pride, and their pride lay in ruins. She had built with humility, and her humility had endured. A week later, Silas came back. He did not come with advice or warnings. He came with his hat in his hands, a piece of paper, and a small nub of a pencil. He found Ilara outside, reinforcing the sod on the roof. He stood before her, a large, powerful man made small by circumstance. He did not meet her eyes at first. He looked at the ground, at the strange barn, at the sky. "Ma'am," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I was a fool, a proud, blind fool." He finally looked at her. "I've lost everything. We've all lost everything. We have to rebuild, but I don't know how. The old way is finished." He held out the paper and pencil. "Teach me," he said. It was not a request, it was a plea. Ilara did not hesitate. She did not seek payment or demand apologies. The knowledge was not hers to hoard. It had been a gift from her husband, a legacy of quiet observation. It was meant to be shared. She sat with Silas on the earthen bank of the barn, and with the whole world as their classroom, she began to teach. She brought out Thomas's books, spreading them carefully on a blanket. She pointed to the diagrams, explaining the principles of aerodynamics in the simple, practical terms she had come to understand. She talked about deflecting force instead of absorbing it, about the strength of a curve over the weakness of a corner. She drew in the dirt for him, just as she had done before. But this time, he did not kick dust over it. He knelt, copying her drawings onto his paper with painstaking care. She explained how she had mixed the clay and the grass, the precise angle of the roof beams, the importance of the building's orientation to the prevailing winds. He asked questions, dozens of them, not with the skepticism of a critic, but with the earnest curiosity of a student. She answered every one patiently. She was not just giving him a blueprint. She was giving him a new way of seeing the world, a world where strength was not always about standing tall. That spring, a new kind of construction began on the plains. Under the guidance of Silas, who was now Ilara's most devoted disciple, the community began to rebuild. But they did not raise tall, square frames against the sky. They began by digging. They laid foundations of stone and earth. They built low, curved walls and arched roofs. They were not building barns. They were building shelters. They became known, affectionately, as prairie turtles, for their low shells and their ability to weather any storm. The physical landscape of the county began to change. The sharp, angular lines of the old farmsteads were replaced by the soft, organic curves of the new structures. The farms began to look as though they were growing out of the land itself, rather than being imposed upon it. The work was slow and hard, but it was done with a new sense of purpose. The men no longer worked with loud, defiant pride, but with a quiet, focused humility. They had learned a hard lesson, written in splintered wood and lost livestock. They were building not for dominance, but for endurance. The story of the widow's barn and the prairie turtles of that county began to spread. A government agent from the Resettlement Administration, sent to document the devastation of the Dust Bowl, came across the strange new buildings. He was baffled, then intrigued. He spent a week there, interviewing Silas and the other farmers. He spent a day with Ilara, who quietly explained the principles behind her design. He took photographs and made detailed sketches. His report, filed away in a dusty archive, told the story of a community that had adapted to its hostile environment in a remarkable way. Articles began to appear in agricultural journals and even a few national newspapers. They told a story of Midwestern ingenuity, but they often got the details wrong, attributing the design to the master builder Silas or to some forgotten pioneer tradition. Ilara's name was rarely mentioned, but she did not mind. She had not done it for credit. She had done it for Samuel and for Rose. She had done it so her children would have a safe place to sleep when the wind began to howl. Years passed. The rains eventually returned, and the plains grew green again. The wind still blew, but it was no longer an executioner. It was just the wind. The children grew up. Samuel went off to study engineering, his mind filled with the diagrams from his father's books and the memory of building a sanctuary with his mother's hands. Rose became a teacher, telling stories to a new generation of children who had never known the terror of a black blizzard. Ilara lived out her days on the farm. She grew old, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, her face a roadmap of sun and worry and wisdom. Her earthen barn stood for decades, its sod roof thick with wildflowers in the spring. It became a local landmark, a quiet monument to a lesson learned in the heart of a storm. Travelers would sometimes stop and ask about it, and the old-timers would tell them the story of the great duster and the widow who had listened to the earth instead of shouting at the sky. The final lesson was not one of architecture or engineering. It was a lesson in humility. The community had learned that nature is not an adversary to be conquered, but a force to be understood. They learned that the loudest voices are not always the wisest, and that true strength is often found in the quiet, patient work of a single, determined soul. They had been saved not by more force, but by a better idea. They learned that sometimes, to survive the storm, you must have the courage to bow before it, to build low, and to trust in the wisdom that lies hidden in the earth itself.